Longtime elementary school teachers. Which of your former students surprised you the most by their adult life outcomes or personality? I had a severe speech impediment in elementary school to the point where teachers would foist me off in the reading room for kids with learning impairments and difficulty reading to get extra assistance during class, despite the fact that I was writing and reading at a very high level. The only person who vouched for me was my speech teacher. I met with her 3x a week during elementary school. She allowed me to stay in her classroom during lunch when they forced us to go to the playground and it was 5 degrees out. She gave me work to do over the summer so I could get to a point where I could actually say my name properly, which had been my only goal. She encouraged me to tell my 5th grade teacher that I was reading at a higher level than he suspected, and, buoyed by her confidence in me, I did it and was moved to the highest reading group. I just told my parents this story earlier this year and they were so angry I had been ashamed to share, but grateful I had an adult vouching for me. I ended up graduating speech in 5th grade after years of working with her and she was so proud. She had changed my life and given me the gift of speech. She believed in me when other teaching professionals simply heard me talk and assumed that it was easiest to assume I was a slow learner. I am now the communications director for a government official in my country. I messaged her on Facebook when I first got my job to tell her that I wouldn't be where I am without her. She remembered me, of course. She said I wouldn't let her forget me, and she couldn't be more proud. She is one of my biggest online cheerleaders and I couldn't be more grateful for her work. I quite literally would not be where I am without her. That is so touching and inspiring. Thanks. I had a student that used to get into fights and was extremely aggressive and violent towards others. On the last day of 5th grade, his last words to me and his class were "frick you." Many years later he came back to the school I'd been teaching at and looked for me so he could give me a big hug and apologize. In his words, "I was garbage when I was here. Thank you for putting up with me and I'm sorry." I cried like a baby. I was so proud of him. You know, teaching can sometimes be a thankless job and a lot of the things I'm really proud about are usually only shared between me and my students. They don't give out a lot of medals to teachers, you know. Anyway, thanks for your time and attention. Overwhelmed by how many people got to share one of the best moments of my career with me in this friggin' post. The student whose social skills were non-existent and whose academics were equally as troubling as in college taking nuclear physics. I swear he was easily like 3 grades behind when I knew him in primary junior grades. Canada. I started in elementary school. One of my first students I had when she was in 3rd grade. Her father was abusive when she was younger and mom left him and was raising her on her own, but her mom was also heavily involved in gangs. She was very behind compared to the rest of the kids, but she was always very helpful to the other children, me, and the staff. I had a soft spot for her and she ended up being one of my favorites. Teachers will often say they don't have favorites, but that's a lie. A couple years later I was moved to 5th grade and I had her again. She was struggling a lot by this time, but still, I never gave up on her, and she never gave up either. Later, when she was in 8th grade, I was moved to middle school, and once again, I had her again. By this time her mom's lifestyle had had an influence. She always wore red, threw up gang signs, and used to get into a lot of fights at school. One thing that was different was she had caught up academically with the rest of her peers, and actually even surpassed many of them. She used to come by after school and started seeing me as a mentor, and we had a connection, as I too was heavily involved with gangs in my teens and early 20s. When she moved on to high school, she kept in touch. Her high school was across the street and she used to come by after school all the time to check in. She eventually got involved in student body, became the senior class president, and was on the honor roll all 4 years. She got accepted into all 8 colleges she applied for. She is currently on a full-ride scholarship at Stanford University and plans to continue with graduate school. She is very involved with the community too. She is currently 20 and a waitress but is planning on doing big things, and I know she will. I'm so proud of her. Ro, amazing job. You made a huge impact on her life. The world needs more teachers like you. I'm not one of these great success stories, but I'm back home visiting and actually ran into my 3rd grade teacher at Starbucks. I was working on my laptop, WFH, but my parents' Wi-Fi is crap, so I work at Starbucks when I visit. I saw her sit down and it just kept bugging me why she looked so familiar, because I swear when I was in 3rd grade I thought she was at least in her 50s, so she would have to be like in her late 70s now or something like that. Chalk it up to a child's memory. Anyway, when I noticed she was getting ready to leave, I asked if she was Ms. 3rd grade and she said yes with a kind of confused tone, and I explained who I was and that she had been my teacher. She was so excited to see a former student and kept thanking me for taking a chance and saying hi to her, and that she wished more students would do that because she loves getting to hear about her former students' lives. So I guess if you are on the other side of this question and you see a former teacher, don't be afraid to reach out and just say hi, explain who you are and just thank them for their role in your education. She remembered me as the little girl obsessed with acting and reading. Still true today. I guess my mom might count since she's worked at the elementary school I attended since 1993, but she recently told me about one of my elementary school classmates. I was actually pretty good friends with him, but I thought he was a bit slow, and apparently, he had been evaluated for learning disorders several times in early grade school. He apparently just started a surgery fellowship at a prestigious hospital in Philadelphia. He definitely worked very hard in grade school and middle school, and now that I look back, he definitely sought out the smart kids in class and tried to befriend them and see how they thought. Not me, but know a guy, lovely quiet chap who lived to draw. Teacher said his work was no good. Went on to be a senior effects artist and later works for a major computer games company and can of course, draw. We call it primary school in the UK, and my mum's friend taught Ewan McGregor in P5. Apparently he was just a normal kid, youngling. My brother was tutored by an elementary school teacher and he was a complete mess of a student as a kid. She was helping him transition from a top prep school to public school because the prep school didn't feel he would ever amount to much in their care. She tried several methods to keep him organized and help his reading skills to no avail. She continuously checked in with his teacher, worked at the same school, to see his progress and constantly had to talk to him on behalf of the teacher. Everyone loved him. He was just an utter mess. We ran into her a year ago and got to tell her that he got a full ride to law school at an Ivy League school. Blew her mind, but proof that some kids thrive in different learning environment. Terrible through traditional school, but when he got to college, he thrived because of breaks between classes. Time to study, picked his classes which were focused, then trying to cover 1,000 topics in a year, and got to know his teachers. Thank goodness for my parents holding out hope all those years, haha. I read it as tortured and for some reason it still works kinda. Not me, but a kid who used to be my friend. He was studios. He got good grades. Teachers loved him. He was well behaved. He wasn't bullied. He didn't bully other kids. He had a lot of friends. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't unpopular. He was definitely more popular than me though. No one had a problem with him. Since he got good grades, his parents let him do whatever he wanted. They bought him whatever he wanted. He had the latest video games and consoles as they came out. We loved sleeping over his house because we could stay up all night, jump on the trampoline at 2 in the morning, and we didn't even have to sneak out for mischief. We could just walk out the door. Anyways, he moved in 8th grade. I was sad. A couple years back someone sends me a Facebook message of a local article. This guy stabbed someone 23 times and is awaiting a murder trial. I have no clue where his life took a hard left turn, but it did clearly. Whoa, that's wild. And sad. It's strange when it's someone you knew. I teach English as a second language and I had a kid who spoke Arabic who barely could master English in the beginning, to be expected of course. Well, 8 years later he's on his way to being an astrophysicist. He came to school to find me to tell me last year, and I've never had a prouder moment teaching. He told me I was the only one who believed in him. Not mine, but my mom's story. She used to teach the 2nd grade and there was a kid who was ruthlessly bullied because he had another finger on his hand. He didn't come from a very good background and had to work jobs in the middle of school for his family. This is pretty common for low-income families in India. He was shouted at a lot by the principal as he missed like half of the school, so my mom told him to come to our house so she could tutor him every few days. He's now studying mechanical engineering at IIT, very prestigious university in India, and reached to my mom on Facebook and thanked her. I was expecting famous pianist. Not an elementary school teacher, but as a former child, I have something to say for Mr. Folly. Frick you Mr. Folly, I'm good at drawing. As a former child Lumpheo. I've been on our PTA for a long time. Does that count? There was a very skinny quiet kid who was super smart. The other kids picked on him quite a lot, but he never stood up for himself. I always thought he would work for NASA or something as he was so smart. I saw his LinkedIn a few months ago and he is now a prison officer at a maximum security prison. Half the smart kids from high school are doing great and the other half are the host at Applebee's, and it's so confusing. I had to be tutored for reading during elementary school. The same teacher came to my house after school a few times a week to help me. Years later, my mom ran into her and she asked how I was doing. She was so incredibly happy and shocked to hear I was an English major applying to library science graduate programs. Reading all these people who didn't do so well as a student but very successful now just makes me feel like crap, because I was a pretty good student academically and turns out not very bright after I graduate. Same here. I was top of all of my classes and always getting told that I had loads of potential. Then I left school and had a massive psychiatric breakdown, and now I have done literally nothing with my life. Not a teacher, but my best friend in high school was the most picked on kid in a high school of 4,000 students. He definitely wasn't much of an academic and seemed destined for barely getting through life. He's now worked his way up in fast food, has franchised a couple Dairy Queens, and worked for Homeland Security in between. Till Homeland Security's connections in Dairy Queen. Not me, but my soon-to-be mother-in-law. We were out shopping together for a gift for my fiance. We ran into a former student of hers. She was working at a makeup counter of the department store we were shopping at. They talked for a little bit and I thought it was sweet that this girl still remembered her elementary school teacher. After we walked away, my soon-to-be mother-in-law told me that girl working at the makeup counter was her best student ever and she graduated high school as the valedictorian. The valedictorian of my graduating class had a mental breakdown, ran away from college, and had everyone thinking she was dead for almost 3 months. Her family found her in Key West with literal peroxided looking hair. She is doing better now, but the pressure to perform is insane for those poor people. I'm not a teacher, but something along the lines happened to one of the kids I graduated with. She was top of the grade 4 academics and sportswoman of the year every single year since we were 13. She was head prefect in middle school and head girl of our high school in our matric year. Both her parents were senior management at our old middle school. She was very rich. Both her parents drove sport cars and she got an Audi SUV for her birthday. She also lived in a Poe's huge house. Last thing I heard from her is that she got accepted into one of the best universities in the country, Stellenbosch University, for veterinarian science. I mean, if anyone was going to succeed it would be her. She's now a secretary at a rundown accounting firm in Pretoria that's badly in debt. She's also been to rehab twice. I have no idea what happened to her, but it just shows nothing is cast in stone. You had me Poe's huge. I had a math teacher in high school that was an absolutely evil person to any student that dared to ask questions. One day she refused to answer questions, so when I was lost I just sat back in the chair and observed rather than taking notes. She went on a tirade in front of the class about how I was a quitter and would never amount to anything. I ultimately became a teacher to correct these issues in education, and a few years ago got my first assistant principal job. Guess who taught math there? Yep. The same math teacher. We obviously had issues with her, but I made a point not to hold a grudge, and honestly she seemed super proud that I had been successful, apparently forgetting all of the horrible things she said to me and all of my classmates. While in her class she was surprisingly pleasant to her kids, not a great teacher but good enough to avoid trouble. Well, in 2019 I walk by her door and hear her yelling at a student in an incredibly familiar way. I put her on leave to investigate and all of the kids shared exactly what I knew. She was evil. We told her she would resign and that based on the evidence we had we were doing her a favor instead of firing her right then and there. This lady all of a sudden remembered how mean she was to me and claimed that I was retaliating for how mean she was to me in high school and refused to quit. Ultimately, I fired the teacher that made my life heck in high school, and I'm not going to lie, it was kind of nice. I was mean to my students since decades ago is probably not the best defense to being fired for being mean to students. I was voted most likely to burn a book, ended up writing one. My dad was a bad kid in school, like really bad. Fought teachers, suspended half the year, expelled from school dances, etc. Anybody in their right mind would bet their life savings against the chance he'd make anything of himself professionally. Well, now he's 49, never went to college, but worked his way up to his current job making six figures and had been offered promotions to pay more. Talking to him and meeting him, you'd never guess he was probably the worst kid in the entire school district. Plus, he'd beat my butt if I ever did the crap he did. I'm pretty late to this thread, but I hope at least one person gets to read this. I happen to work at an auto parts store the town over from where I grew up. I moved to California, to the heart of the Central Valley. Myself along with my two other siblings were placed in the local K-6 school. I had the fortunate pleasure of having Ms. Adisho, who was such a loving and caring woman. She was always so kind and gentle that on few occasions I haphazardly called her mom. I used to cringe at that, but I think maybe she found it sweet. A woman strongly resembling her came to the auto parts store late afternoon with her husband. They were looking for a light bulb, and being the lone cashier assisted them. The more I spoke to her, the more I asked her questions. I could feel it. This woman, her demeanor, was so similar to my kindergarten teacher. At this auto parts store we have a rewards program, which involves your phone number to earn rewards points. Well, as typical, I asked her for her number, and at my amazement Mrs. Adisho appeared on the screen. I immediately had to ask her, "Excuse me, are you Ms. Adisho, the one who taught at El Capitan?" I ask since I think I was one of your students. I am. At the moment I was 21, but even after more than a decade, she remembered me. She said am. She asked me how I'd been, what I had done with my life. I informed her that I was going to junior college and had applied to a couple UCs here in California: Berkeley, UCLA, Davis. I told her about me getting published, about my academic achievements, my want to become a doctor. She paused for a moment, and her tone changed to something somber. She said, "Thank God. I thought I had messed you kids up." Frankly, I don't blame her. I knew what she meant. The school was underfunded, understaffed, and underprivileged. She did the best she could, and perhaps felt it wasn't enough. I replied, "Not at all. I think you did a great job." We said our goodbyes soon after, and she walked slowly out the store with her husband standing by the door. She began to cry, but her crying wasn't sad. It sounded like relief, joy, and maybe happiness. Her husband hugged her, and they walked back to her car. I saw them drive away, and I wonder what kind of impression I made. I wonder why she cried. Out of joy and getting rid of the guilt, or just IDK how to say it off her chest knowing she did a good job. My mom taught all the way from elementary school to high school and always used to tell us about this one student. This guy was at the top of his class in academics, was the star in both the basketball and football team, was adored by all the teachers, and everyone was talking about all the great things he was going to achieve in life. He got into a really good school for the 11th and 12th grades, one of the best in the country. 6 months later, news came about that he'd tried to commit suicide but survived with permanent damage to his spine. Our whole school was in shock because this guy was supposed to be the real deal. He was supposedly great at everything. I was in 7th grade when we all found out. I wasn't necessarily close to him, but I'd spoken to him a couple of times, and I never knew someone that tried to take their own life, so I was pretty shaken. He still visits our school sometimes and has to walk in crutches permanently. He's very open about his problems. He had a severe Adderall addiction which his parents supported, being doctors, and leaving a school that was a constant echo chamber telling him how great he was, getting into the real world, and realizing he was just one among many overachievers brought him into depression. The school he went to was a boarding school and with no access to Daryl. He was constantly on edge. He's a lot more humble now and gave a lecture in our school on academic pressure. He's now helping students as a guidance and career counselor. I feel as though I can comment on this from a few angles, but only currently from the angle of a former student. When I was a kid I was a bit of a smart butt, loved to skateboard and found my way into a ton of trouble. There were a few incidences but one that stands out was when I got caught bombing cars with eggs from the overpass. Some of my teachers understood me and that my behavior was perpetuated by a precarious home life and helicopter parents. I would act out as a form of rebellion, but there were many teachers that just thought I was a trash individual and they let me know it. Welp to the hypothetical surprise of those teachers that weren't fond of me. I'll be graduating with my master's in special education with a 4.0 in 2 weeks, and will now be the teacher watching students surprise me through the years. Can't wait. I think this applies to me. I was the kid that never passed exams the first time. Kids would tell me in middle school I would never graduate first semester of high school. I didn't pass 7 out of 14 classes. Right now I'm halfway through a master's program for bioscience engineering at one of the best universities in Europe. I would still call myself a mediocre student, but it's getting better. My thesis will be about vertical farming and for the first time in my life as a student, I'm excited. I moved so much in elementary school that I went to 5 schools, spanning across 2 states, so reading this thread is making me go, but in a good way. I was teaching 3rd grade. I had a kid that would literally shoot spitballs in class, through a straw. Kid would bring his own straws to school and chew notebook paper to shoot. This happened every day, probably 7 or 8 times a day I'd catch him doing it. He would just start freaking with other kids, poking them with pencils and crap loudly in the middle of class. Now, I hate sending kids to the principal because I feel it undermines my authority in the class. This kid was different though. He got sent to the office average twice a week. Just couldn't deal with it. He goes on to high school. I don't hear good things about him. I don't hear much, just that he'd fallen in with a bad crowd. It's 2005 when I'm teaching him in 3rd grade. Flash forward 16 years and I pull up to a red light on my way home from work. Red Lamborghini. Who is sitting there in the driver's seat? Of course this kid. No sunglasses. Actually he had pretty nerdy hip Jeffrey Dahmer glasses on. "Mr. Igot," he says. And he smiled at me. Seemed really genuinely happy to see me. I didn't even had time to compose myself, realize it was this kid and respond before the light turned green and he rocketed off. He had this smile on that I'll never forget. Good for him. Looks like little fella straightened himself up. Most of the bad behavior comes from a bad background which influences the children. Not a teacher, but I do have a story. Back in elementary school I was always the smart kid. As definitions of smart elementary school kids go, it means I'm good at algebra. Another kid struggled with basic stuff, even into his high school years. I meet him about half a year ago, in relation to a business inquiry in Germany. He's apparently now a business owner, which has to do with tutoring, but since expanded into a small consulting company. We're having dinner next Friday. That's fantastic. I taught pre-K for about 3 years, almost 30 years ago. I taught, in separate years, 2 boys who would go on to be murdered, together, before even graduating high school. They were tortured by an adult psychopath, in a flophouse drug apartment, naked, bound, begging, in front of a captive audience including some kids they'd known as long as they'd known each other. They were stuffed into the trunk of a car, driven to the gas station, marched to an area just out of sight of several businesses, doused in gasoline, set on fire, and shot execution style. The man who shot them was mentally ill to start with, but also used them to the point of near constant psychosis. He'd just been cleared for discharge after a 72-hour involuntary psych hold, and had only been home 2 days. He was still in acute, paranoid psychosis, but had been assessed evaluated by inpatient psychiatrists as safe to discharge home. They were the same age as my child. They knew each other from 1st grade on. They had a lot of closer friends in common, some of whom I'd also taught way back all those years ago, some of whom had been unwilling witnesses to their friends' torture in the hours leading up to the murders. One of them committed suicide a week later. Anyway, I'm now a practitioner in Reunited and have been for 20 years. Spent several years at a level 1 trauma and burn hospital. Got really familiar with the terrible things people do to themselves and others. None of it hit me like these deaths had. I hadn't been desensitized yet, and I'd taught these kids how to tie their shoes and write their names. They'd been in classes, on field trips and sports teams, to birthday parties with my son for so many years. The way their lives ended, or were irrevocably changed, was as shocking as it was gruesome. I taught gym and had a little dude who excelled in my class but was a thug in everything else. My wife's food truck catered for a bike run where a lot of outlaw MCs took part. I saw the kid there and he was now the president of his own outlaw MC. He remembered me and introduced me to his old lady and other gang members. I was super proud of him. My mom has been a teacher for the past 25 plus years. There was one student in particular that stood out. This kid was insanely smart. In high school, perfect grades. He also got scholarships on scholarships plus full ride to almost any college he wanted. I think he wanted to be a physicist or engineer for NASA. After high school he headed off to college and fell off of everyone's radar for a while. We learned a few years later what happened. The extreme pressure to always be the best ended up getting to him. Everyone in his life understandably had super high expectations for him, but he couldn't handle it. He had a massive mental breakdown and ended up dropping out of college and went to work in some chain fast food place. I didn't know him personally and only met him in passing, but even I was sad. Such a brilliant mind, someone who had a lot of potential, reduced to a tiny fraction of himself. It's been several years since then, and I hope he is doing better. Him taking 5-10 years off to decompress, and then continuing with life sounds like a great life to live. He has a lot of potential, and some time off from life sounds like the perfect treatment. I think he has such potential to do great things. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.